Okay, so hello, AP World History. Tonight's lecture is actually a recap of the last part of your summer assignment PowerPoint, and so this is looking at the Persian Empire. And sorry if you heard that buzzer, that was my dryer going. But just to clarify in the summer assignment, the entire summer assignment was on period 1. With the exception of I added the Persians at the very end, and that's partly because I squeezed the Persians in pretty quickly together with the Greeks, because there's really just some key elements that we have to focus on for the AP exam, so they actually fit well together. So the classical period is we're looking at organization and reorganization of human society. So to remind you of our little acronym in class, it's quiet people make great human resources. And so one of the things we've been looking at the last couple of weeks, whether it be the Mauryas, the Guptas of India, or the Qin and Han dynasties of China, we're now going to look at the Persians and see that they had a lot of the same issues that they had to address, such as how do you efficiently administer an empire over a vast territory that, especially for the Persians, that's going to encompass a lot of different ethnic groups and different peoples. So just to briefly remind you of our big picture themes for period 2, or the classical era, new belief systems emerged. So we haven't quite gotten to Christianity. We'll see that in a couple of weeks when we look at Rome. But we did address that Buddhism was founded during this time in India, and Buddhism will actually spread to China through Silk Road trade. The number and size of empires are going to grow dramatically, so we're going to be able to trace the development of the Persian Empire. And the volume of long-distance trade and communication exchange increased substantially. So we've discussed the Silk Road trade that connected China to the Mediterranean, and we'll talk about that again when we talk about Rome. But we're going to see that the Persians also had a very extensive road network. So let's go ahead and jump in with the Persians. So Persia today is what we refer to Iran. And the Persian Empire is actually got a pretty long history. There's going to be 4 major dynasties: the Achaemenids, Seleucids, Parthians, and the Sassanids. But for our purposes, we're going to mostly just focus on the Achaemenids. So who are the Persians? Where do they come from? This actually goes back to something I had you look at in period 1 in your summer assignment, in those Indo-European migrations. And so the Persians are really going to be pastoral or nomadic peoples that slowly migrated out of what they believe is Eastern Europe, what would be present day the Ukraine and Western Russia. And they are going to eventually settle in what is present day Iran in the Middle East. In fact, that area, as they start to enter, was already empires. It was originally the Sumerians, so again, review from period 1, and you had the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, and those empires were weakening, and so these Indo-Europeans are going to migrate in. They were pastoral peoples, which meant they were not sedentary, they were not agriculturalists. They herded animals and fed off of the plant life as they traveled. And so it's going to actually be Cyrus the Shepherd who's going to be the one who founded the Achaemenid dynasty. He was known as being somewhat of a gentleman, but he happened to be very talented militarily. And so despite being a shepherd, he is actually going to be able to conquer, he's going to be able to unify Persians and conquer the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and found the Achaemenid dynasty. However, the empire is going to grow, and the Achaemenid dynasty is really going to meet its peak under his son Darius. Darius is going to rule a territory all the way from the Indus River Valley to the Aegean Sea. So that means across the Mediterranean, as far north as present-day Armenia to the Nile River Valley. So this is going to be a massive empire under Darius, and he is going to build a capital at Persepolis. So Persepolis is one of our key cities of period 2. So what's really interesting to focus on with the Persians is how did they develop their ruling system. So how did they show people they were in charge, to quote the key concepts, and what kind of techniques did they use to administer their empire? And this is why, the College Board and the key concepts includes the Persians, because the system they set up, the bureaucracy they create, is really going to be modeled by other civilizations as well. And to keep in mind, I've heard this question come up in class as you guys are working in your groups. What is a bureaucracy? And a bureaucracy is when a ruler or emperor uses government officials to manage their empire instead of elected representatives. So, there's some pros and cons to that. If you are a government official, that means you're a paid employee of the empire. So to a certain degree, you would be expected to be loyal to your ruler, since they're your source of income and employment. However, you can sometimes have issues of people being awarded a government official position when they're not really effective officials, and sometimes we see that when bureaucracies are overrun by ineffective administrators, that could sometimes lead to a weakening of an empire. So the bureaucracy that the Persian Empire created is actually known as satrapies. And a satrap was the administrator of a satrapy. And a satrapy, kind of think of it as like a county or a large territory. And so essentially the entire Persian Empire was divided into 23 satrapies, where a satrap was in charge to basically maintain the local peoples. Now, to ensure the satraps remained loyal to the empire, the Persian emperor also created a system of spies. And sometimes those spies would arrive in a county to conduct a surprise audit. So maybe they'd make sure that taxes were actually being collected and that all taxes were actually being turned over to the empire and not being withheld by the satraps for their own personal gain. This is also a time for spies to come in and make sure there's no evidence of a possible local rebellion or revolt developing. So this will be a very effective way to rule a large territory, because obviously, at that time where you have very primitive means of travel and communication, you need to be able to rely on your satraps to be doing their job and officiating that local area. The other major accomplishment of the Persian Empire is they're going to standardize currency or standardize coinage. And you're going to see that phrase a lot this year, standardized coinage. Well, what does that mean? It's when the empire actually goes through the effort to make sure that coins are actually the value of the metal that they're made of. And this is really important for economic development. Economics is a mix of math, science, and human behavior. And one of the things that keeps an economy healthy is when people have faith and know that the currency in which they use is actually the value at which it is stated to be. So to make sure that all coins are of identical metals, size, and shape is going to help maintain a healthy economic system. So that's going to be really important when a empire is able to standardize coinage, and that's going to be one of the successes that even the Qin established in China as well. So that's a commonality we'll see amongst these massive empires. Another major accomplishment of the Persians was their massive road building, and they're actually going to build what's known as the Persian Royal Road, and it extended 1,600 miles. And on that royal road system, they actually established the first ever postal system. So that's a major accomplishment. Again, with such a massive empire, you had to be able to communicate quickly and efficiently, whether you had to defend yourself against outside invasion, or you had to be able to quickly send message of a possible internal issue like a revolt or rebellion. Communication was definitely essential. So before we get to the decline of the Achaemenid Empire, one last thing to note, and you'll actually see this on your practice quiz this week. Another major accomplishment is an example of technology and human environment interaction, and this is known as the Quanat system. When you have such a massive empire, of course the number one concern is keeping your people healthy and fed. And the Persian Empire is traditionally in a lot of desert area. So in order to maintain irrigation, because obviously they're no longer pastoral nomadic peoples, as soon as the dynasty was established, those groups of people now became agriculturalists and sedentary. So with their dry climate, they were forced to become innovative, and we're going to see that this is, very common throughout human history, that when human beings live in a tough territory to live in, whether it be from mountains, deserts, lack of water, too much water, floods, and so forth, it's going to force them to develop new technologies in order to maintain their health. So the Quanat system was a way to basically dig up well water and to control that well water for irrigated lands. And so you can see this diagram here. You have the well water source, and then you have access points so that people can maintain the system. And then it was designed to funnel water, and then that water was distributed to dams and channels where they can use for land irrigation and agriculture. So this is pretty sophisticated technology considering what resources they had available compared to the modern era. So that is, again, one of the other major accomplishments of the empire, is just how to maintain irrigation for agricultural surplus. Because remember, part of a agricultural society, you have to have surplus for specialized laborers. So decline of the Achaemenid Empire, under Cyrus and then later Darius, for the most part, Persians had a policy of toleration. To elaborate on that a bit, they actually, they obviously conquered many different peoples, and one of the ways they tried to avoid rebellion is that they allowed local cultures to maintain their own culture. They did not necessarily impress upon Persian belief systems. They didn't force conversions. Darius is not going to be quite as tolerant as Cyrus in the sense that he allows religious freedom, but he is going to rule a little bit more headstrong, a little bit more strict than Cyrus before him. But they are going to allow the rebuilding of temples in Jerusalem. Judaism under the Babylonians and the Assyrians had been persecuted, so that just shows that this was not a Jewish empire, but they allowed Jewish people to practice freely. However, down the road you have Xerxes, and I learned last year that a lot of students have not seen the movie 300. I made a reference to Xerxes and Gerard Butler yelling Sparta as he's about to kick a Persian messenger into a well. So maybe a few of you have seen it, but it's a good movie. It's definitely R-rated, so ask your parents before watching it if you haven't seen it. But Xerxes in that movie is definitely portrayed as, it's based on a graphic comic book based on history, but this kind of mythical figure. However, Xerxes is definitely going to be known as being too harsh. He's going to start to repress his people. He's going to start to suspend some of that policy of toleration of rulers before him. And due to that treatment over a vast empire, it's hard to maintain a vast empire and rule harshly. And so that's going to start to lead to the decline of the Achaemenids. And then after that, we'll have the other dynasties. But for the most part, we're not too concerned with those for this class. So the Persian Wars, and so this is, it's kind of good to point out, because part of this week we're also looking at the Greeks. To understand a lot of this Greek development and Persian development was happening simultaneously. But while the Greeks are developing, and we'll see that in a later video lecture, there's going to be Ionia territory just north of Greece, and there's going to be some rebellions occurring up there, especially as the Persians are starting to encroach upon that territory and try to conquer it. And so the Greeks of the peninsula, so if you look at a map geographically, Greece jets out into the Mediterranean Sea. They're going to start to unite. The Ionians and the Greeks are going to start to unite against the Persians. And the Persians will be defeated at the Battle of Marathon, and they're going to retreat back. 10 years later, they're going to have further defeat at land and sea of Thermopylae. And again, those are battles that are covered in that movie 300. So for my history buff students, this is where this all ties in with some of the Hollywood interpretation of history. The Achaemenid Empire is going to ultimately be invaded and conquered by Alexander the Great of Macedon, and Macedon was its own empire or kingdom, small empire, small kingdom at this point, just kind of like northeast of Greece as well. And so that's going to really be the turning point and the end of the Persian Empire. So kind of switching gears from political developments, the Achaemenids, what was social development in classical Persia like? As I mentioned, these peoples were originally early steppe. So steppes are geography where It's not really conducive to agriculture. So they're highlands, they're flat desert-like highlands with shrubs and bushes. However, they're good territories for herding animals. So that's where we have a lot of our nomadic pastoral traditions come out of the steppes. One of the things I've touched upon in class is that most nomadic or pastoral traditions include a real emphasis on warrior elite and being able to fight efficiently. And so a lot of times it's our nomadic pastoral peoples that are the most efficient warriors on horseback. And oftentimes they're actually going to be the ones that teach agriculturalists through interactions, the use of the saddle and the stirrup. And that also means family and clan relationships are very important because they're moving as tribes. They have to have very close relationships for their survival. But as they get settled and as Cyrus develops the Achaemenid Empire, they're going to create a bureaucrat class. So that means you're going to have peasants and agriculturalists and farmers. This means you're going to have artisans and craftsmen, but this also means they've basically created another social class that's elevated of government officials, and government officials could be tax collectors, record keepers, or even translators. Especially with the Persian Empire, they conquer so many different peoples, so translators is going to be very crucial to their ability to administer their empire. However, the bulk of society is free in the Persian Empire. So as I said, there's artisans, craftsmen, merchants, civil servants. Their faith is be Zoroastrianism, and I'll cover that in I think the next couple of slides. But within Zoroastrianism, there's priests and priestesses and temple servants, so they're also going to be elevated on the social hierarchy. You got rural peasants. Such a large empire and so many people living in urban centers such as Persepolis, you're going to need to have a pretty massive agricultural surplus to maintain the population. And as I mentioned earlier, they're going to remain very tolerant of local customs of conquered peoples and not necessarily force them to abandon their cultures to become Persian. Slaves. Was there slavery in the Persian Empire? That's always a big debate among historians. There was. Slavery, however, was not promoted under Zoroastrianism. So you're not going to really see Persians using slaves. However, a lot of the people they conquered used slaves. And as part of that toleration of local customs, they're not going to necessarily force people to give up slavery. So there was slavery in the Persian Empire, but it was not on a large scale by any means. The type of people that might have become slaves were prisoners of war. Sometimes it was partly conquered populations or debtors, people unable to pay their taxes. You'll see this in both cities and countryside. Sometimes children and spouses would be sold into slavery to get out of a debt situation. Principally what you saw was domestic servitude. So basically, this might be a caretaker. If a woman is a domestic servant, she would probably raise the children of a wealthy slave owner and so forth. And many would be owned by the temple communities, so sometimes people also sold themselves into slavery for religious purposes. So the economic foundations with the vast empire, several areas were actually exceptionally fertile, and so this is going to allow for a lot of produce or agricultural surplus to be allowed, and so they'll be able to use things like the Persian Road to transport food goods across the empire. As I mentioned earlier, they're going to develop these as standardized coins, and with the established coinage system, this means you're also going to start to have banks, and you're even going to have merchants investing in commercial ventures, and so it's it's a pretty modern economic system the Persian Empire is going to develop. Long distance trade is going to grow very rapidly along the Persian roads, and various regions all contributed particular products to the economy. So because the empire is so vast, certain regions had goods or supplies that they specialized in that they're able to trade within the empire. So lastly, we're going to look at the emergence of the monotheistic religion in the Persian Empire. So our earliest monotheistic religion, Judaism, that comes out of period 1, and Zoroastrianism also was born in period 1, but it is going to carry over into the classical era. And so, where did this faith come from? Just like Judaism, it's a monotheistic religion, meaning they believed in one God. So it's definitely a departure from most of our typical period 1 faiths that were polytheistic, where they believed in many gods. Zarathustra was believed to be the prophet of Ahura Mazda, so that was the name that they gave to their god. and they believe, and then the teachings of this faith, they believe evolved out of the late 7th and early 6th centuries. They say believe, and I say historians believe because they have to rely on archaeological evidence of people following this faith. The doctrine is elusive, which means they did not really compile all of their beliefs early on into one single book, so it's hard to exactly pinpoint when the faith originated, because most of the teachings were transmitted orally by the priests and priestesses. The priests of Zarathustra were known as magi, and so Zoroastrianism is the faith of Zarathustra. So it was a monotheistic religion. It will actually come into contact with Judaism and also influence some Jewish beliefs, and is also going to shape a lot of beliefs of Christianity. They believed in an omnipotent deity, so another way to phrase that is an all-knowing God that was responsible for all of creation. They believed that there was some kind of conflict with an evil spirit, so very similar to the idea of a devil. And they believed that there was a system of rewards and punishments for how you lived your life in the afterlife. So they didn't quite call it heaven, but they did refer to a paradise in the afterlife where people would face some kind of final moral judgment. So that concludes our look at the Persians, and then we're going to get into the Greeks.